Mom, you need to stop taking those pills. Right now. That was the first thing my son said to me the moment I stepped through my front door after my trip, and for a second, I thought he was joking. I let out a small laugh, setting my suitcase down on the hardwood floor, still holding on to the quiet warmth of the past week I'd spent away. What pills, honey? I asked, brushing a strand of silver hair behind my ear, my voice calm, almost amused. But Daniel didn't smile. He didn't even move. He just stood there in the entryway, his hand still gripping the edge of the door, as if he needed something solid to hold on to, his face pale in a way I hadn't seen since he was a boy. Behind him, in the soft glow of the kitchen lights, Vanessa appeared, her arms folded loosely across her chest, her expression composed, almost too composed, the kind of stillness that makes you notice it without knowing why. I frowned slightly, my eyes shifting between them. The vitamins your aunt sent, Daniel said, his voice tighter now, controlled but strained underneath. The ones you've been taking every day. I blinked. Oh, those, I said lightly, waving a hand as if to dismiss the concern. They're just supplements. Your Aunt Carol swears by them. She said they'd help with my energy. I bent down to unzip my suitcase, suddenly aware of how tired my arms felt, how heavy my body seemed after the drive back. I've actually been feeling a little better lately, I added, though even as I said it, the words felt uncertain, like I was repeating something I told myself more than something I truly believed. Daniel stepped closer, too quickly, his shoes scraping softly against the floor. Mom, when did you start taking them? He asked. I paused, my fingers resting on the zipper, thinking. A few months ago, I suppose? Right after your last visit. Vanessa helped me organize them into that little pill box, remember? I glanced up at her with a small, appreciative smile. She returned it instantly, smooth and effortless, but her eyes didn't quite follow. It's important to stay consistent with supplements at your age, she said, her tone gentle, practiced. You've been doing so well keeping up with them. Daniel's jaw tightened. I noticed it this time. A small movement, easy to miss if you weren't looking directly at him. Mom, he said again, more quietly now. Have you had a doctor look at those? Like, a real doctor? I let out a soft sigh, straightening up slowly. Daniel, honey, I've been taking care of myself for a long time. Not everything needs a prescription. I tried to keep my tone light, reassuring, the way I always had when he worried too much. But something in the room had shifted, something subtle but unmistakable, like the air before a storm you can't yet see. Vanessa moved then, stepping closer to the counter, picking up a glass of water that had already been poured, as if she'd been expecting us. Why don't you sit down, Margaret? She said, her voice calm, almost soothing. You must be exhausted from your trip. I hesitated for just a second. It was the way she said my name. Not unkind, not sharp, but distant in a way that felt new. Or maybe it wasn't new, and I had just never noticed it before. I lowered myself into the kitchen chair, the familiar cushion beneath me offering less comfort than it used to. My legs felt weaker than I remembered, a dull heaviness settling into them that I'd been blaming on long drives, on getting older, on anything that made sense. Daniel pulled out the chair across from me, sitting down but leaning forward immediately, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped tightly together. Mom, I need you to trust me, he said. I studied his face, the worry etched deeper than I'd ever seen it, and something inside me shifted, just slightly. I do trust you, I replied. Then please, he said, his voice dropping almost to a whisper, don't take another one of those pills until we figure out exactly what they are. The words hung there between us, heavier than they should have been. I turned my head slowly toward the counter, toward the small plastic container where I kept my daily doses neatly arranged, each compartment labeled, each pill placed there with care. Vanessa followed my gaze. I saw it then, just for a moment. A flicker. Gone almost as quickly as it appeared. Daniel, she said softly, you're overreacting. They're just supplements. Your aunt sent them herself. He didn't look at her. Which aunt? He asked. Silence. Not long. Just long enough. I felt my fingers curl slightly against my lap. Carol, I said automatically, though the answer felt less certain now, like a memory I hadn't fully examined. Daniel shook his head slowly. Mom, he said, his voice steady now, too steady. And Carol passed away 2 years ago. The room went very still. I stared at him, waiting for the correction, for the explanation that would make everything make sense again. But it didn't come. And for the first time since I'd walked through that door, I felt something colder than confusion settle quietly into my chest. Something that didn't ask questions. Something that simply knew. Something wasn't right. I did not respond right away because my mind refused to accept what he had just said, and instead it drifted somewhere safer, somewhere quieter, like the small kitchen I stood in every morning over the past few months, sunlight spilling gently through the window above the sink, warming the counter where I kept that little white pill organizer, each compartment labeled neatly with the days of the week. Each one filled by Vanessa's careful hands while I stood nearby holding my coffee, trusting her without a second thought, because that is what family does. It trusts, it leans, it allows itself to be taken care of when the years begin to weigh heavier on the body than they used to, and I remember how she would smile at me, soft and reassuring, telling me that consistency was important, that these supplements would help with my energy, my focus, my balance. All the little things I had quietly begun to lose but never spoke about out loud, because admitting weakness feels like admitting you are no longer needed, and I had spent my entire life being needed, first as a wife, then as a mother, and later as the steady center of a home that no longer seemed to belong entirely to me, so I took the pills, every single day, without question, even when I noticed how tired I still felt in the afternoons, how my hands sometimes trembled just slightly when I reached for a glass, how the stairs felt steeper than they used to, and I told myself it was age, because age is an easy answer. It does not accuse anyone, it does not create conflict, it simply settles in quietly and explains everything away. And when Daniel visited a few months ago, I remember him watching me as I moved around the kitchen, slower than I used to, pausing more often than I needed to, and he asked if I was feeling all right, and I smiled. Of course I smiled, because mothers do not want their children to worry, and I told him I was fine, just a little tired, nothing serious. And Vanessa stood beside him, placing a gentle hand on his arm, telling him that I had just started a new vitamin routine, that it would take time, that everything was under control, and he nodded then, though I remember now that he did not look convinced, not entirely, but he let it go. Because that is what people do when someone sounds confident enough, they let it go, they trust the person who seems to know what they are doing, and over the weeks that followed, the routine became part of my life in a way that felt almost invisible. I would wake up, make my coffee, take the pills, and move through the day with a kind of quiet fatigue that never fully lifted, but never felt alarming enough to question, and when my trip came up, it felt like a small escape, a chance to breathe outside of that routine, to feel like myself again, even if just for a few days. And I remember packing my suitcase, carefully placing the pill organizer on top of my clothes, because Vanessa had reminded me twice not to forget it, her voice light but insistent, and I laughed, telling her I would not forget something so important, and she smiled, that same composed smile, and now, sitting here at my kitchen table with Daniel's words still echoing in the air, I realized something that made my chest tighten in a way I could not explain. During that entire trip, I had forgotten to take them, not once, not a single day. The organizer had stayed zipped inside my suitcase, untouched, and yet I had felt different, lighter in a way I had not noticed at the time. I had walked longer distances without needing to stop, I had slept more deeply, woken up with a clarity I had almost forgotten was possible, and I had not connected any of it to the absence of those pills, not until this moment, not until Daniel sat across from me with that look on his face, and slowly, very slowly, I lifted my eyes back to the counter, to the place where the pill container sat waiting, neat and orderly and familiar. And for the first time, it did not look like something that was helping me, it looked like something I did not understand at all, and the trust one had placed so easily, so naturally, began to feel less like comfort and more like something I should have questioned a long time ago. Daniel did not speak again right away, and that silence stretched across the kitchen in a way that felt heavier than any argument could have been, because silence leaves space for thoughts, and my thoughts were no longer calm. They were moving, connecting, rearranging pieces I had ignored for months, and I became aware of every small detail around me as if I were seeing my own home from the outside: the ticking of the clock on the wall, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the glass of water Vanessa had set on the counter just within my reach, placed there with the same quiet efficiency she used every morning, and I realized how often she had anticipated my needs before I even spoke them, how natural it had felt at the time, how grateful I had been for the help, because there is a point in life when help begins to feel like kindness rather than control, and I had crossed that point without noticing. And now Daniel was watching me carefully, not rushing me, not forcing the moment, just waiting, as if he understood that whatever realization was forming inside me needed to arrive on its own. And slowly I reached for the pill container, my fingers hesitating just above it before I finally picked it up, the plastic cool and familiar against my skin, the little compartments still neatly arranged, each one holding the same small tablets I had trusted without question, and I turned it over in my hands, studying it as though it might reveal something simply by being looked at. Long enough. But it remained what it had always been, ordinary, harmless in appearance. And yet nothing about it felt harmless anymore, not after what Daniel had said, not after what I had just remembered about my trip, and I lifted my eyes toward Vanessa, who was still standing by the counter, her posture unchanged, her expression calm in a way that felt deliberate, like someone maintaining control over a situation that had not yet fully slipped away, and for the first time I did not look at her as the woman who had helped me. I looked at her as someone I did not entirely know, someone whose actions I had accepted without ever asking why, and that realization alone created a quiet distance between us that had never existed before, and I spoke carefully, choosing each word as if it mattered more than it should have. "Vanessa, where did these come from?" And she answered without hesitation, her voice steady. "I told you your aunt sent them." But the answer did not settle anything, it only deepened the unease, because now I was listening differently, not just to the words but to what sat behind them, and Daniel leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Mom, we need to have them tested." And Vanessa let out a small breath, almost like a soft laugh, though it carried no humor. "That is unnecessary, Daniel, you are making this into something it is not." But he did not look at her, he kept his eyes on me, and that was when I understood something else. This was no longer about convincing me, this was about giving me a choice, and I looked down at the container again, feeling the weight of it in my hand, and for a brief moment I considered the possibility that all of this was simply a misunderstanding, that there was a reasonable explanation waiting just out of reach, but then another thought followed quietly behind it, a thought that felt far less comfortable. What if there was not? What if the explanation was exactly what it appeared to be? And I closed the container slowly, the small clicking sound echoing more loudly than it should have, and I placed it back on the table, not pushing it away, not yet, but no longer holding it either, and I nodded once, a small movement, but it felt significant. "All right," I said softly. "Have them tested." And Daniel exhaled, not in relief exactly, but in something close to it, like a step forward in a situation that had been standing still for too long. And Vanessa's gaze shifted, just slightly, her composure still intact but no longer effortless, and in that subtle change I saw something I had not seen before, not fear, not quite, but calculation, and that was when I realized that whatever truth was coming, it had already been here for a long time, waiting, hidden in plain sight, and I had only just begun to see it. Daniel did not waste time once I agreed. He stood up immediately, reaching for the container with a care that felt almost protective, as if even touching it required caution now, and he turned it in his hands briefly before placing it into a small plastic bag he pulled from the drawer, something he must have prepared before I even arrived home, which told me this had been on his mind longer than I realized. And as he sealed it, the soft sound of the plastic closing seemed louder than it should have been, final in a way that made everything feel more real, and I watched him, noticing the way his movements were precise, controlled, not rushed but not relaxed either, and it occurred to me that he was not just reacting, he was already thinking ahead, already planning the next step, and Vanessa shifted slightly beside the counter, her fingers brushing against the edge of the surface in a slow, almost absent motion. But nothing about her felt absent, she was present in every sense, aware of every movement, every word, every pause, and yet she said nothing more, not this time, and that silence from her felt different than before, less confident, more measured, as if she was choosing not to push any further, at least not yet, and Daniel glanced at me again, his voice softer now. "I am going to take these to a lab first thing in the morning," he said, "just to be sure." And I nodded, because there was nothing else to do at this point but wait, and waiting has always been something I know how to do, though this kind of waiting felt different, heavier, filled with questions I had not allowed myself to ask before, and after a moment, Daniel stepped toward the door, pausing briefly as if he wanted to say something else, but instead he simply gave me a small, reassuring look and left, the sound of the door closing behind him echoing through the house in a way that made the space feel larger, emptier, and I remained seated at the kitchen table, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my eyes drifting slowly back to the spot where the container had been sitting just minutes ago. And it felt strange how something so small could leave such a noticeable absence, and Vanessa moved then, picking up the glass of water she had prepared earlier, holding it out toward me with the same gentle motion she had used countless times before. "You should drink something," she said, her tone calm, almost caring, and for a moment, everything looked exactly as it always had, the familiar kitchen, the familiar routine, the familiar offer of help, but the feeling behind it had changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious to anyone else, but enough that I noticed it, enough that I did not reach for the glass right away, and instead I looked at her, really looked this time, at the steadiness of her posture, the ease of her expression, the way she held herself as if nothing had shifted at all, and I wondered how long that had been true. How long she had been standing in front of me like this while I saw only what I expected to see, and I finally accepted the glass. Not because I wanted it, but because refusing it would have been a different kind of statement, one I was not ready to make just yet, and I took a small sip, setting it down carefully on the table, my movements slow, deliberate, and she gave a small nod, as if everything was still proceeding as it should, and then she turned back toward the counter, continuing with quiet tasks that did not need to be done. Wiping a surface that was already clean, adjusting items that were already in place, and I understood then that this was not about the kitchen, it was about control, about maintaining a sense of normalcy even as something beneath it had begun to shift, and I sat there for a long time after that, long enough for the light outside to soften and the house to settle into evening, and my thoughts moved through memories I had not examined closely before, small moments that had once seemed insignificant, the way Vanessa would remind me about the pills if I ever forgot, the way she kept them organized, the way she always seemed to know exactly how many I had left without checking. And each memory on its own meant very little, but together they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore, and I realized that whatever answer Daniel would bring back from that lab, it would not create the truth. It would only confirm what had already been quietly building, piece by piece, in the background of my life, and as I sat there in the fading light, I felt something settle inside me, not fear, not panic, but a calm awareness that whatever was coming next, I would meet it differently than I had met everything before. The next morning arrived more quietly than I expected, as if the house itself understood that something important was unfolding and chose not to disturb it, and I woke earlier than usual. Not because I had to, but because my mind refused to stay still, replaying every detail from the night before, every word Daniel had said, every look Vanessa had given, and I lay there for a few moments staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the house around me, the distant hum of the heater, the soft creak of the floor as it settled, and for the first time in a long while, I did not feel that familiar heaviness in my chest when I took a deep breath. And that absence alone made me sit up slowly, noticing how steady my hands felt as I rested them on the edge of the bed, and I remained there for a moment, testing the feeling, as if it might disappear if I moved too quickly, but it did not, it stayed. Quiet but undeniable, and I stood, walking carefully at first, then a little more confidently, making my way to the kitchen where the morning light had already begun to fill the space, soft and pale, and everything looked exactly as it always had, the same table, the same counter, the same neatly arranged items, except, for one thing, the small container was no longer there, and its absence felt louder now in the daylight than it had the night before, and I moved toward the coffee maker, going through the familiar motions, pouring water, measuring the grounds, pressing the button, and the simple routine felt grounding, something steady to hold on to while everything else shifted, and I poured myself a cup, wrapping my hands around it, letting the warmth settle into my fingers, and I stood there by the counter, looking out the window without really seeing anything beyond it, because my thoughts were elsewhere, turning over the same question again and again, not what the pills were, but why they had been given to me, why they had been so carefully managed, why I had been encouraged to take them every single day without fail, and that question did not feel like panic, it felt like clarity, the kind that comes slowly but firmly. And I heard footsteps behind me, light and measured, and I did not need to turn to know it was Vanessa. Her presence had a way of filling a room without making noise, and she stopped just a few feet away, close enough that I could feel her there, but not close enough to touch, and for a moment neither of us spoke, and then she said, "You are up early." Her voice calm, as if this morning were no different from any other, and I took a small sip of my coffee before answering. "I could not sleep." And I turned then, meeting her eyes directly, not briefly as I used to, but fully, and she held my gaze without hesitation, her expression composed, steady, almost reassuring, and yet there was something behind it now that I could not ignore, something that felt like it was waiting, calculating, and I set my cup down carefully on the counter, my movements slow, deliberate, and I asked, "How long have I been taking them?" And she did not pause, did not search for an answer, she already had one ready. "About 4 months," she said, and I nodded slightly, letting that settle. "Every day?" I asked, and again she answered without hesitation. "Every day." And there it was again, that certainty, that smoothness, the kind that does not invite further questions, but this time I did not let it stop there. "And you never thought to have a doctor look at them?" I asked, keeping my voice even, not accusing, just asking, and for the first time, just for a fraction of a second, something shifted in her expression, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me, a slight tightening around her eyes, a brief pause before she replied, "They are supplements, Margaret, not prescriptions." And she gave a small, polite smile, as if that explanation should be enough, as if it always had been, and I held her gaze a moment longer before nodding again. Slowly, "Of course," I said, and I turned back to my coffee, lifting the cup, taking another sip, letting the silence stretch just a little longer than was comfortable, and I could feel her watching me now, not in the casual way she used to, but more carefully, as if she were trying to understand something that had changed, and she spoke again, softer this time. "Daniel worries too much." And I let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "He always has," I said, and I did not turn back toward her this time. I simply stood there, looking out the window, feeling the weight of her presence behind me, and in that moment, I understood something clearly. Whatever was happening, whatever truth was about to surface, it was no longer hidden from me, not completely, and I did not need to confront it yet. I did not need to rush, because rushing would only give away what I knew, and for now, it was enough to let her believe that nothing had changed, that I was still the same person who trusted easily, who accepted explanations without question, and as I stood there in the quiet of the morning, holding my coffee, feeling steadier than I had in months, I made a quiet decision, one that did not need to be spoken out loud. I would wait, I would watch, and when the truth finally arrived, I would be ready to meet it on my terms. The rest of that morning passed in a quiet rhythm that would have seemed ordinary to anyone else, but to me, every moment felt sharpened, every detail more defined than it had been before, and I moved through the house with a kind of calm awareness I had not felt in years, noticing things I had once overlooked, the way Vanessa checked her phone more often than usual, the way she lingered near the front window as if expecting something, the way her voice remained steady but carried a careful softness that felt less natural the longer I listened to it, and I did not confront her, not yet. Because there is a kind of strength in silence that people often underestimate, and I had spent most of my life speaking when something felt wrong, smoothing things over, asking questions, trying to understand. But this time felt different. This time I understood that understanding would come on its own, and all I needed to do was observe. And so I did. I watched the way she prepared lunch, the way she placed my plate in front of me with the same gentle precision she always had, the way she asked if I needed anything else without quite meeting my eyes. And I answered her as I always did, politely, calmly, giving her no reason to believe that anything had shifted inside me, and yet everything had. And as the hours passed, I found my thoughts returning again and again to the past, not in a scattered way, but in a focused sequence, as if my mind were retracing steps I had once taken without paying attention. And I remembered the first time Vanessa had suggested the supplements, how casual it had seemed, how reasonable. She had spoken about health, about energy, about maintaining independence, and I had agreed because it made sense, because it aligned with what I wanted to believe about myself, that I was still capable, still in control, and I realized now how easily that desire had been used, not forced, not pressured, but guided, gently, consistently, until it became routine. And I remembered how she had taken over the responsibility of organizing them, how she had insisted it would be easier for me, how she had made it seem like a favor rather than a necessity, and I had accepted it without hesitation, grateful for the help. And over time that small act had grown into something larger, something that shaped my daily life in ways I had not fully recognized. And I sat in the living room that afternoon, the sunlight stretching across the floor, my hands resting quietly in my lap, and I thought about the way my body had changed over the past few months, the fatigue, the unsteadiness, the moments when I felt less like myself, and I had attributed all of it to age, to time, to the natural progression of things. Because that explanation was easier, safer. It did not require me to question anyone or anything beyond myself, and yet now, with that explanation beginning to unravel, I was left with something far more unsettling, the possibility that those changes had not been as natural as I believed, and that possibility did not bring panic, it brought clarity, a quiet, steady clarity that settled deeper with each passing minute. And I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway sometime in the late afternoon, the familiar low rumble of Daniel's engine, and I did not rush to the door. I did not stand or call out, I simply remained where I was, listening as the engine shut off, as the car door opened and closed, as footsteps approached the house, and I felt my heartbeat slow rather than quicken, because whatever he was about to say, whatever he had learned, it would not surprise me the way it might have yesterday. And the front door opened, the sound carrying clearly through the house, and I turned my head slightly, watching as Daniel stepped inside, his expression serious, focused. And for a brief moment our eyes met, and in that look I saw confirmation. Before a single word was spoken, not of the details, not of the specifics, but of the direction, the truth was not going to be simple, and it was not going to be easy, and yet I felt something steady within me, something grounded, as if I had already begun to prepare for it without realizing, and I rose slowly from my chair, not rushing, not hesitating, simply moving forward to meet whatever came next, knowing that this time, I would not be the last to understand what was happening in my own home. Daniel closed the door behind him more slowly than usual, as if he needed that extra second to steady himself before stepping fully into the house, and I watched him from across the room, noticing the way his shoulders were slightly tense, the way his eyes moved briefly toward the kitchen and then back to me, and I did not ask him anything right away because I already understood that whatever he had learned was not something he could say lightly, and he took a few steps forward, stopping just short of where I stood, and for a moment neither of us spoke, and then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. Holding it carefully, not dramatically, just with a kind of quiet weight that made it clear this was the answer we had been waiting for, and he exhaled slowly before speaking. "I had them tested at a private lab," he said, his voice controlled but firm. "Not just a basic check, I asked for a full analysis." And I nodded once, my hands resting loosely at my sides, my posture steady, because I had already prepared myself to hear something I would not like, and he glanced down at the paper briefly before continuing. "They are not vitamins, Mom," he said. And the words did not shock me the way they might have the day before. Instead, they settled into place like the final piece of something I had already begun to understand, and I held his gaze, waiting, and he went on. "They contain compounds that can slow down your metabolism, affect your balance, your energy levels, even your mental clarity over time." And I felt a small shift in my chest, not panic, not fear, but recognition, because those were the very changes I had been experiencing, the very things I had explained away as age, and he added, more quietly now, "Long term, they could make you dependent, weaker, easier to manage." And that was the word that lingered, manage, not care for, not support, but manage, and I let that sit in the silence between us for a moment before asking the only question that mattered now. "Who would give me something like that?" And Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, his eyes moving past me for just a second, toward the kitchen, toward the space where Vanessa had been earlier, and then back to me, and he did not answer immediately, which in itself felt like an answer, and I followed his glance without turning my head, aware now of the quiet presence behind me, and Vanessa stepped forward slowly, her movements measured, her expression composed but no longer effortless, and she spoke before Daniel could, her voice calm, almost gentle. "Margaret, you are misunderstanding what this means," she said, and I turned then, fully facing her, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a clarity I had not felt before, and I studied her face, the same face I had trusted, the same eyes that had watched me take those pills every day, and I asked, quietly, "Then explain it to me." And she held my gaze, her lips pressing together for a brief moment before she spoke again. "Those supplements were meant to help regulate certain things, to keep you from overexerting yourself, to maintain stability." And the words sounded careful, chosen, as if they had been prepared in advance, and Daniel let out a short breath, shaking his head slightly. "That is not what the report says," he replied, his tone sharper now, and she turned to him, her expression tightening just a fraction. "You are interpreting it the wrong way," she said, and I listened to both of them, but I was no longer focused on the details of their argument. I was focused on something simpler, something clearer, the fact that she was not surprised, not confused, not asking questions about the results. She was explaining them, adjusting them, guiding the meaning, and that told me more than the report itself ever could, and I took a small step forward, closing the distance between us just slightly, enough that she could not avoid my gaze, and I spoke again, my voice steady. "You knew." And it was not a question, and for the first time, she did not respond immediately. And in that pause, in that single moment where her composure faltered just enough to be seen, I understood everything I needed to understand, and the room felt very still around us, the kind of stillness that comes when something has finally been revealed, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, and I did not raise my voice, I did not demand anything more, because I no longer needed to. The truth was already there, clear and undeniable, and as I stood there looking at her, I realized that whatever came next would not be about discovering anything new, it would be about deciding what to do with what I now knew. The silence that followed did not feel fragile, it felt solid, like something that had finally taken shape after being invisible for far too long, and I did not look away from Vanessa because I no longer felt the need to soften the moment, or make it easier for anyone, not even for myself, and she stood there across from me, her posture still straight, her expression still composed. But that careful balance she had been holding on to was beginning to show its strain in small ways, the slight tightening of her lips, the way her fingers pressed together just a little more firmly than before, and Daniel remained just to the side, not interrupting, not stepping in, as if he understood that this was no longer something he could resolve for me, this was something I had to face directly, and I took a slow breath, steady and measured, letting it settle before I spoke again. "You made me believe I was getting weaker," I said quietly, not accusing, simply stating what had become clear, and she shook her head almost immediately, a small, controlled movement. "That is not what happened," she replied, her voice still calm but no longer as effortless as it had been earlier, and I tilted my head slightly, studying her. Then what did happen? I asked, and this time she hesitated, just for a moment, and that hesitation said more than any explanation could have, and she stepped closer, not aggressively, but deliberately, as if closing the space between us might restore some sense of control. You were struggling, Margaret, she said, choosing her words carefully. You were forgetting things, you were getting tired more easily. I was trying to help you maintain some stability. And I listened, really listened, not to the explanation itself but to the shape of it, the way it shifted responsibility away from her and placed it gently back onto me, and I felt a small, almost imperceptible change inside myself, something settling into place, something firm, and I nodded once, slowly. So you decided that for me? I said, and her eyes held mine, steady, unblinking. Someone had to, she replied, and that was the moment everything became unmistakably clear, not because of what she admitted, but because of how easily she said it, how naturally she assumed that position, as if it had always belonged to her, and Daniel let out a breath beside me, sharper this time. That was not your decision to make, he said, his voice no longer controlled, and she turned toward him, her expression tightening just slightly. You were not here, she said, and there was something sharper beneath the calm now, something closer to frustration. I was the one taking care of everything. And I felt the words land between them, heavy with something that had been building long before this moment, but I did not let that become the focus, because this was not about their disagreement, it was about mine, and I stepped forward just enough to bring her attention back to me, and I spoke again, my voice steady, quieter than before but far more certain. You did not take care of me, I said. You controlled me. And she did not deny it this time, not directly. Instead she held my gaze, her expression shifting into something more guarded, more careful, as if she was recalculating, adjusting to a situation that was no longer predictable, and I could see it clearly now, the way she had moved through my life over the past months, not forcefully, not obviously, but consistently, shaping small decisions, guiding routines, creating dependencies that felt like support, and I had allowed it. Not because I was weak, but because I trusted her, because I believed she had my best interests at heart, and that realization did not bring anger, not in the way I might have expected. It brought something colder, something steadier, a quiet understanding that anger would not help me now, and I turned slightly, glancing toward the window for just a moment before looking back at her, and I said, I am going to stop taking anything you give me. And the words were simple, but they carried a weight that settled immediately into the room, and she inhaled slowly, her shoulders lifting just slightly before settling again, and for a moment she said nothing, and that silence was different from before. It was no longer controlled, it was uncertain, and Daniel stepped closer then, not in front of me, not to shield me, but beside me, his presence steady, supportive, and I felt it without needing to look at him, and I realized then that this was not the end of anything, not yet. This was only the point where everything had changed direction, and as I stood there, facing her without hesitation, I understood that whatever came next would not be shaped by her decisions, it would be shaped by mine, and for the first time in months, that felt entirely clear. I did not raise my voice after that, and I did not need to, because something far more powerful had already shifted in the room, something quiet but undeniable, and I stepped back slightly, creating just enough distance to make it clear that whatever place Vanessa had taken in my daily life no longer existed in the same way, and she watched me carefully now, no longer trying to guide the conversation, no longer offering soft explanations, because she understood, at least in part, that the balance had changed, and Daniel remained beside me, steady and silent, his presence grounding in a way that did not feel overwhelming, and I turned my attention to him for a brief moment, meeting his eyes, and in that look I saw not just concern, but something else, something like relief, as if he had been waiting for me to reach this point on my own, and I gave a small nod, not dramatic, just enough to acknowledge that I understood what he had done, what he had uncovered, and then I looked back at Vanessa, and this time there was no hesitation in my voice, no softness meant to ease the moment. From now on, I said, I will handle my own care. And the words felt simple, but they carried a clarity that settled immediately into the space between us, and she inhaled slowly, her shoulders lifting just slightly before lowering again, and for a moment it seemed as though she might argue, might attempt to reshape the situation once more, but she did not. Instead she held my gaze, her expression more guarded now, more distant, and I could see the shift in her thinking, the recalculation, the quiet understanding that whatever control she had once held was no longer secure, and I continued, not raising my tone, not adding emotion, just stating what had already become true. I will speak to my doctor directly, I will decide what I take, and I will not rely on anything that I do not fully understand. And Daniel exhaled beside me, a subtle release of tension that I felt more than heard, and Vanessa's lips pressed together slightly, not in anger, but in restraint, and she nodded once, a small, controlled movement that acknowledged what I had said without agreeing to anything beyond it, and the room grew still again. But this time the stillness felt different, not heavy, not uncertain, but settled, as if something had finally been placed where it belonged, and I turned away from her then, not abruptly, not dismissively, but with intention, walking toward the kitchen table where I had sat the day before, where everything had first begun to unravel. And I rested my hand lightly on the back of the chair, feeling the familiar wood beneath my fingers, grounding myself in something steady, something real, and I realized then how much of my recent life had been shaped by small, unseen decisions, choices made quietly, gradually, without confrontation, and how easily I had accepted them because they had come wrapped in care, in concern, in the language of help, and I did not feel anger rise in me as that understanding settled. I felt something else, something clearer, a kind of quiet resolve that did not need to announce itself, and Daniel stepped closer, his voice softer now. "We will figure out the next steps together," he said, and I nodded, because that felt right, not as dependence, but as support, the kind that does not replace your decisions but stands beside them, and I glanced once more toward Vanessa, who remained near the counter, still composed, still present, but no longer central to what came next, and I knew then that whatever relationship we had before would not return in the same way, not after this, not after what had been revealed, and that did not require a dramatic ending, it did not require raised voices or final words, because some endings are not marked by conflict, they are marked by clarity, and as I stood there in my own home, feeling steadier than I had in months, I understood that this was not just about what had been done to me, it was about what I would allow moving forward, and that decision, unlike the ones that had been made quietly around me, belonged entirely to me, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like enough.